So this week was an interesting week. I got to this point. I got to yesterday actually thinking about this sermon and this message, and I kept thinking to myself, there's just nothing coming. I'm really struggling with this whole idea. Of course, I came up with the idea on Monday. I think it was Monday that I began thinking through this whole idea of pilgrims, road warriors, and traveling mercies, thinking about the spirituality of travel. It seemed like a good idea at the time. But in the midst of this week, I kept thinking, I'm just not getting any traction on this. I'm not really figuring out what it is I'm trying to say. And by Thursday, I kept thinking, where's my head been? And then I remembered, I've been 3 days at our annual conference in Mansfield. Well, at least I think I was there. I don't remember it, actually. I don't know if you've ever experienced a slow, torturous death. I don't know if you've ever been. In fact, George and I were talking. We met in the hallway. I think it was you I was talking to. And George is now retired as an ordained Methodist minister. But I remember thinking, because I said, I've been coming to these things off and on for, 20, 30 years. And he said, they haven't changed. It felt like the same annual conference back in 1987. And while there was some high moments, perhaps, there we are sitting in a church, in a sanctuary, in pews for hours at a time while they're rattling off reports and such. And it can be excruciating. And that's where my mind has been. It's sort of been in a vacuous void. And here this text really speaks to that whole matter. I hadn't really seen it at first. But I could have easily looked around that sanctuary, and as much as I love a lot of them I don't know, but as much as I love all of those different folks, I could have easily said, and God looked out on the void and darkness. But then I forgot to create. I was thinking about why this creation story. And in fact, I'm going to walk back here because I need to get my phone so y'all can keep looking forward here. And I'll keep talking. But I was trying to think about this text and the other text that we have for the lectionary. Now, I don't preach or speak to the lectionary every Sunday. A lot of ministers do. They use it as a guide to sort of keep themselves, exposed to all the different scripture verses and such. But some of them are really uncomfortable and awkward. And so a lot of ministers would just rather sort of pick and choose the passages that they would explore. And I, myself, thought, well, I don't really have anything in mind in particular. We'll just go with it. But we are entering into what's called ordinary time. There's nothing else going on. Jesus has been born, Jesus has lived, Jesus has taught, Jesus has died, been resurrected, and then a few weeks later, Pentecost, and the disciples have been baptized, and now it's just ordinary. And it's going to be like this. This is the longest period in the lectionary. It's funny, you just keep on going all through the summer, and it's usually like the 4th week of Easter, or the 5th week of Kingdom Tide, or that sort of thing, or the 6th week of Lent. We have the 37th week of ordinary time. By the time you're at week 25, I'm sure ministers are wanting to, kill themselves or run or leave, or let's just have a song fest and forget about it. And so then I look at this text, and I think of I see the two texts that are offered today, and I'm thinking, I don't know. We've got this beautiful text, and I chose the Message version because I think it's so narrative and poetic in the way that it describes the creation story. Of course, there are two creation stories in the Old Testament in Genesis, this being the first one. And then I looked at the Gospel lectionary. So this is the Gospel lectionary, okay? Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And remember, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. What do those two have in common? The Great Commissioning and the creation story. What an odd pairing. Now, this is one of the appearance stories. This is one of those sections that has been added as part of the gospel. It's another appearance story. We have the ones where they're on the road to Emmaus. We've heard that one before. The disciples walking, they meet with the man, and it turns out to be Jesus. We have the one where he comes into the house, and then the doubting Thomas. That's the doubting Thomas text. There's a number of these different stories. This is the one at the end of the Gospel of Matthew, an appearance story where, in this context, Jesus then sends them on what we call the Great Commissioning. So the question is, why the pairing of these two? And I couldn't for the life of me think of anything other than they didn't know what else to do with it. You have to have a Great Commissioning. Jesus has to tell the disciples. And then I thought, it's summertime. It's ordinary time. What better time to think of something extraordinary? In reality, most of us miss it. Most of us don't make the connections. Most of us are caught up in what we experience as ordinary time, which often comes across as chaos or boredom. And what do we do when we're in the midst of chaos or boredom? Well, your car breaks down. What do? Take it to a repairman. You get sick. You have an unexpected diagnosis. You panic. What do? You go see a doctor. Typically, in the midst of chaos, we go see if we can't get someone to fix it. And in the midst of boredom, what do? Most of the time, we might turn on TV. We might decide we need a vacation. We might look for a movie to go see. We might decide on going out to dinner. But one of the last things that we actually ever think about doing is, I think I'll sit down and create something. In the context of chaos, it's probably the last thing that occurs to us is maybe I should just sit down, take a deep breath, and think about what I could create at the moment. It's a profound idea, this idea of taking what feels ordinary, what feels void, what feels chaotic, and actually taking initiative. While some people would say that the creation story, that the story in Genesis is really all about explaining to us who God is or how this world came to be, even if metaphorically as a story, to think in terms of how this world came to be, that some greater being was involved in its creation. While a lot of folks look to this story as a classic creation myth, and then there's other folks who think of it as science, but I'm not one of those. But I certainly think in terms of the power of mythic tales, but I think there's something else here that we often miss. I think we're given a clue as to who we are supposed to be. I think when God says, let us make them in our image, we are given a major clue in how we might ought to think about living our lives. So I'm going to tell you a quick little story. I'm going to a Father's Day story, because it's the only one that occurred to me as I was thinking this week, and it seemed appropriate for the day. But when my uncle would get bored, he would often call me and my brother up, and he would take us out fishing. He would take us hunting, he would take us fishing. Usually it would be an overnight trip, and he would give us all the wonderful mysteries of the experience. What are we having for dinner tonight, Uncle Mac? And Uncle Mac would look over and say, frog legs and branch water. And we wouldn't eat. I mean, luckily Mom would make us sandwiches and stuff, and we typically would eat that. He always made life interesting and mysterious. On the first camping trip that we went out, it was a hunting camping trip, and I don't hunt myself. But he had his little .410 shotgun, and we went out into the deep woods, and we said, Uncle Mac, what are we doing? He said, we're going to find a snake. We were little kids. We're going, well, you're going to find a snake? We're going snake hunting. Now, me and my brother thought that was pretty ominous. So he takes his flashlight and his shotgun, and we're going off into the woods, and about 15, 20 minutes into it, he shouts, looky there, boys! And we all practically jump out of our skin, and we look ahead, and there is a rattler rolled up with its head perched and its fangs bared, And Uncle Max says, "Back, boys!" And he grabs up his shotgun and plow. And it knocks that snake out of the ground. Off the ground and into the woods. And he smiled and said, "All right, boys." And my little brother and I going like, "Wow. That's amazing." Never did find the snake, and found out a couple of weeks later it was stuffed. It was just a fake snake, something from a taxidermist. He set it out there and just set the whole thing up. I found out from my older brother. He was like, "Yeah, he did that for me too. I remember that hunting trip." So when I try to do the same kind of thing with my son, it doesn't always work out. I don't somehow have that same ominous sense of power and mystery that my uncle was able to create for me. And when we took him out fishing, we didn't have the same kind of luck. We went fishing down at Port Aransas about 2 years ago, my younger son, Matthew. And as we were fishing, we weren't having any luck at all. It was a gorgeous night. The moon was shining. We were out there on a dock looking out over Port Aransas and tossing out the bait on the hook and stuff. And all we were pulling in were these nasty-looking alien-like fish that were called hardheads. And they have these spikes coming out of their head. And you have to have pliers and thick leather gloves because the things will pierce right through. And so half the time we'd cut the string and toss it back. And my son was just getting more and more disappointed. Like, "Dad, come on." So we'd try it again and we'd catch another hardhead. And so finally I said, "Matt, nothing's working." But we had a trip planned. We had a fishing excursion planned on one of those little semi-deep sea things, They take about 20 or 30 people out. And we went out the next day, and Linda and myself and Matthew, we went out. We were out, a mile or so off of the coast, and people were catching stuff. The guy came along, baited it. You're guaranteed to catch something. They were catching grouper and snapper and all sorts of other kinds of fish, reeling them in, and we were going, "Okay, there's one over there." We'd run to that side of the boat, and we'd cast it out, and nothing would happen. So then we'd run over here because they were catching fish. And after 3 or 4 hours of this, we caught nothing. Everybody caught something. And at the end of the trip, as the guy says, "We're going to have to wrap it up," he says, "I'm sorry for the McDermott." He's saying this over the speaker. "I'm sorry for the McDermotts who weren't able to catch anything." And as we're reeling things in, this guy has a bite. And he says, "Wait, I've got something." And so Matthew comes running over, practically tears in his eyes because he hasn't caught anything. The guy hands him the rod, and he starts wrestling and reeling it in, and it's another hard head. And, of course, as we got off the boat at the end of the day, the guy says the same thing. He says, "I hope everybody had a great time, even the McDermotts who couldn't catch a single fish. We hope you had a good time." And it was lots of fun, and everybody was laughing, and we were having fun, too, at the irony. Later on that day, we were walking down the street, and a family yelled out from one of the doors in one of the houses on that road. I can't remember the name of that little road, which just follows the shoreline. And the guy had said, "You guys were out there on the fishing boat." "Yeah." So they invited us in, and we had fish with them, and we had a great time getting to know them. And turns out we ended up knowing people that they knew, and it was a really warm evening. And of course, it would never have happened had we not caught the fish, and not likely to have happened. And I remember somebody said once, they said, "Well, that sort of sounds like a God moment, like maybe that was God." And I've always come to this conclusion after hearing all of those kinds of things. You people have had the same experiences where you've had these moments that just seemed so surprising and unexpected. And something positive came out of something negative, and you want to go, "It's a God moment." When the reality is, they're all God moments. The creation says God is in our midst. That's what the creation story is about. It's about God is always creating in our midst. God wants our participation to creating in our midst. And we miss it. So I want to share with you just a couple of quick thoughts. Because this series, we're going to do this for a few weeks, and I want to think with you about what it means to travel, to engage in spiritual travel. And I don't want you to think that that's too strange a phrase. That sort of sounds like astral projection kinds of stuff. But I'm really thinking in terms of how we pack and plan for the sacred in our midst, no matter where we are. Whether we're driving down Chisholm Trail Parkway for the first time and realize I have no idea where I am because nothing looks familiar. Or whether we simply decide today I'm going to walk and I might take the bus downtown because I've never done that. There's always invitations. There are always calls and summons for us to journey and pilgrim into the world, day to day, moment to moment, even as simple as taking out the trash or doing the dishes. Life is filled with these opportunities for sacred travel. But I want to give you a suggestion, a couple of thoughts about how you do that. And the first one is to think in terms of how we tell ourselves our stories. We'll come back to this throughout this series, but this is important to me, I think, and maybe to you, if you haven't thought about this before. Oftentimes, I hear this a lot as a minister. You probably hear it as well. Oftentimes, when something strikes us that's a crisis, or we find ourselves at a loss, we experience the moment as chaos. If we have our wits about us and we tend to be a little more of a controlling, kind of planned out person, we might instead think of it in terms of restitution. I mentioned it earlier. We'd go see someone to get something fixed. Arthur Frank, who was a journalist, experienced a severe cancer that almost killed him, and he went through years and years of different forms of cancer before finally being cancer-free for the last probably 15 years now. But his first book that he wrote was called The Wounded Storyteller, and what was interesting was he started interviewing people in hospitals, including doctors as well as patients, and thinking about how people come to think in terms of their story. How we tell about ourselves, basically, is what I mean by our story. How we refer to ourselves and what's happening. And he said the three primary modes, well, there's two primary that are almost universal. And the first one is chaos, which I've mentioned. And the second one is restitution. And we pretty much live our lives from those two frameworks. Life is moving along fine. We're habituated. Everything's familiar. Something happens. It's chaos. Now, some people get stuck in that. We may even know people we can think of who are stuck in that frame of mind, that everything is just totally out of control. Some people move beyond that into what's really kind of our primary modus operandi for the Western world, restitution. Now, the simplest way to think of restitution is in terms of something's broken, get it fixed, but it goes much, much deeper than that. The way we vacation is centered around that. We plan out trips, and if it doesn't go our way, we get upset. If I'm not sitting next to the person that I really had hoped to be sitting next to on the plane, I get uncomfortable. If my car is broken down, if I'm sick, the problem with restitution is that it's oriented around what I have control of. You see the problem. So then what do? Well, most of us, because we have a fairly habituated theology, in other words, we haven't given much thought beyond sort of what we've grown up with in our theology, most of us at that point simply say, well, then we'll just pray really, 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 really hard. I'm going to step on some toes. Because at that point, we think that God is supposed to fix it. As if God is a repairman somewhere. When God is here all the time, every moment. Now, I hear this. And again, I almost hesitate to say it, but you need to know who I am up front. I hear this all the time from folks. Thank God I've been healed. Well, now I'm not saying, don't say thank God, because I think gratitude is the way of life. I think we all should be grateful no matter what. But I hear it all the time, people saying, these folks prayed and God worked that miracle. God healed my illness. God prepared this house for me to have. God made a way for this to happen. And I only have one problem. I don't think that God is that self-centered or that self-focused or that narrow-focused or that materialistic to opt for someone over someone else who didn't recover, who didn't get the job, who didn't get the house. I think the way in which we see God is the way in which we see life. We're materialistic. We're habitual. We focus on trying to create patterns that are familiar. And what happens is that we feel like the only option is chaos then. Because if we're not in control and God's not in control, then there's nothing. It's just going to be chaos. And again, I think that's fine, except for one problem. When it breaks down, what happens? A friend of mine who's now working in hospice, but has worked in a number of hospital settings. I remember once she told me this, because I've worked with kids with cancer, and I've worked in hospitals as well, but I remember she told me, I had told her once, I said, what happened? Why is it that when this person finally got to that place of illness where it just looked like there was nothing else the doctor could do, nobody showed up anymore? The medical staff kind of came and got the vitals, and then it was over. They just never came back around. So now we have hospice, thankfully, for people to help continue that journey. But she looked at me and she said, it's because they don't know what to do now. There's nothing else they feel like they can do. And I said, then they've forgotten what it means to be healed. Because healed does not necessarily mean you're fixed. Healed means you're whole. And there's lots more left that can be done for that person. The third way in which Arthur Frank says we can look at our stories is the way in which people have been looking at stories for centuries and centuries, especially when story was given its profound sort of place in our human history over sort of materialistic science. And that way is quest, journey, pilgrim. In any story, you understand that someone has a problem or a conflict they have to overcome. But they are never alone. Sometimes it's not always apparent. The God moments aren't always clear. But they're always there. And what I want to encourage you to think about for the next several weeks as we think about what it means to go on vacation, or what it means to travel, or what it means to live this life in the midst of the one who gives us life and being, in the midst of God's presence, what does it mean to live in that world? I think it means that we are fellow pilgrims, that we are fellow journeyers, that we are all a part of this amazing quest. And that we're invited to be a part of it in a way that opens it up for others. Hence the connection to the second text. Do you know what a disciple is? I mean, is a follower of Jesus? A disciple is a student. We're not called to have the answers. We're called to be students. We're invited to be learners together. What would that mean then, not just for day to day, not just for the ups and downs, but even for the moments of vacation? What are we missing when we forget that aspect? Well, I hope you'll come back. I want to think more about all of these things. But for today, I want to leave you with one thing that you'll take with you. This idea of vacation and vocation are so interconnected that I think we forget. It ought to be our vocation to be about finding the joy and the wonder and the mystery in every moment, and to do so with one another, and to celebrate the fact that we are remembering God is in our midst. That's how we make disciples.